Hi, my name is Jenny Feick. Welcome to the third in a series of educational video webinars for the Great Divide Trail Association. We are starting out with videos about the natural history of the Great Divide area. The Great Divide Trail Association is committed to reconciliation, which starts by taking this and every opportunity to acknowledge our honor and privilege to live, work, and play within the Treaty 7 territory. We honor and acknowledge that the GDT passes through traditional Indigenous territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Yahe Nakota, the Tsuut'ina, the Cree, the Shihwepma, the Clay Dana, the Tanaha, the Sinaiaks, and the Métis. The Great Divide Trail Association would like to invite you to advocate for what you love and to preserve nature for future generations to enjoy while educating yourselves and others on Indigenous history and perspectives. Here is what I will cover in this particular talk. The focus is on the flora of the Great Divide, in particular, the large vascular plants that make up the structure of the vegetation zones, forest ecosystems, and habitats through which you will hike while on the GDT. These are the trees, both the deciduous trees and the coniferous trees, as well as the deciduous conifers. I will also tell you about some of the common shrubs that you will encounter along the GDT. Before I begin tonight's talk, I'll just share a little bit about my background. I have a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental biology and a minor in physical geography, a master's in environmental science, and a PhD in natural resources geography, all from the University of Calgary in Alberta. During my 25-year coast-to-coast career with Parks Canada, I worked first as a park naturalist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Waterton Lakes, and Kootenay National Parks, and then in various positions in planning, research, and management in Banff National Park, Yoho National Park, the Western Regional Office, and also in Atlantic Canada in Terra Nova National Park in Newfoundland. From 2000 to 2012, I managed various programs for the British Columbia Provincial Ministry of Environment, including habitat protection, terrestrial ecosystem science, stewardship outreach, climate adaptation for nature, and environmental policy. I retired from full-time government work in 2012, and my husband, wildlife biologist Ian Hatter, and I now live in Invermere, British Columbia. In terms of my connection with the Great Divide Trail and the Great Divide Trail Association, I was one of the so-called original 6 on Project Great Divide Trails crew in 1974, who surveyed the route between Waterton Lakes and Banff National Parks. I was one of the founders of the first iteration of the Great Divide Trail Association, a past board member and a past president for 1 term. I've hiked a lot of the GDT in sections over the years, although not anything yet north of Wilmore Wilderness Park. When the GDTA was resurrected in 2013, I rejoined and started volunteering on trail work parties and also writing articles for the GDTA Pathfinder newsletter. And lastly, I am the compiler and editor of both of the editions of Tales from the Great Divide, vignettes on the origins and early history of the Great Divide Trail and the Great Divide Trail Association. This is a self-published compendium of stories from individuals involved firsthand in the start and the development of the GDT and the GDTA. Okay, as I mentioned in the first or earlier, I'm going to be talking about trees and shrubs. So I'll start off with the role of trees and shrubs in creating or in contributing to vegetation zones, forest ecosystems, and forested habitats, as well as some of their benefits or ecosystem services. And then we'll get to know the trees, the deciduous trees, the coniferous trees, and the deciduous conifers. And we'll also get to know some of the shrubs. As I mentioned in the first video in this series, altitude creates vegetation zones, and different plant species grow at different elevations. It is increasingly difficult for plants, especially the trees and shrubs, to grow the higher up the mountain you go due to the harsher weather conditions. The most species of trees and shrubs occur in the valleys and on the lower slopes, creating the montane forest zone. And further up, the greater amount of snow in the winter influences which species can grow. Generally, they are conifers with tall spire-like shapes and branches that point down in order to help shed the snow. This is known as the subalpine forest zone. In some areas, it's called the snow forest just because of all of the snow that falls in the wintertime. There comes a point when there is so much snow, wind, and cold temperatures in winter that very few plants, especially trees, can grow. And this is the alpine zone, the upper mountain slopes. And we won't be talking about that area really tonight. Trees and shrubs are often used to define an ecosystem type. And this is a map of British Columbia's biogeoclimatic or BEC zones. Many of them, including those near the Great Divide, include the names of the primary trees and shrubs that make up the structure of the ecosystem. And one of the most famous of them along the Great Divide is the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir BEC zone. And there's also one there called montane spruce. Typical forest habitats along the Great Divide include, clockwise from the upper left, the lush, low elevation valley bottom mixed woods montane forests, such as along Upper Waterton Lake in Alberta, the dense north coniferous forests north of Jasper National Park, Alberta, really verging on boreal forest. The mature subalpine forests like this one below Fording Pass in Alberta, on the Alberta side, and young lodgepole forests that are lodgepole pine forests that are regenerating after a forest fire, such as along the Ball Pass Trail, part of the Great Divide Trail that runs through Kootenay National Park in British Columbia. Forest edges are also interesting habitats, and they include tree line, the point above where trees can't grow, as well as the areas where human activity, natural disturbance, or natural features interrupt or prevent tree growth. And counterclockwise from the lower left, you can see former forests that have been logged, like this one north of the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta, or recently burned, like this one on the Summit Lake Trail, part of the GDT running through that park, as well as rocky ridge tops near the natural tree line where whitebark pine likes to grow, such as this one along the High Rock Trail northwest of the Seven Sisters and Crow's Nest Mountain, and subalpine larch forests also approaching tree line along the Rock Wall Trail, part of the GDT in Kootenay National Park, BC. At high elevations, some tree species persist in a bonsai form known as Krummholz, German for crooked wood. These trees, even though they're short, can be hundreds of years old. They have strong, extensive root systems and are dense and bushy with a low profile in response to the intense, bitter winds and short growing season that they encounter right at the very top of where they can grow in the mountains. A tree is comprised of its leaves, stem, trunk, and its roots. When you look at a tree, note that about 5% of the tree is comprised of its leaves, 15% its stems, 60% goes into the trunk, and 20% is devoted to its roots. Through a process called photosynthesis, leaves pull in carbon dioxide and water and use the energy of the sun to convert this into chemical compounds such as sugars and carbohydrates that feed the tree. Trees use a mycorrhizal fungal network to send and receive chemical messages to one another. And in return, the trees provide food that they produce through photosynthesis to the fungi. The fungal highway provides a direct way for plants to communicate with each other and has been dubbed the Wood Wide Web by Dr. Suzanne Simard, who founded the Mother Tree Project. Resources found to transmit through these below-ground pathways include carbon, nitrogen, and water. Trees have the ability to provide an essential of life for all living things on our planet, and that's oxygen. And they also have the power to remove harmful gases like carbon dioxide, making the air that we breathe healthier and the planet healthier. As a byproduct of the process of photosynthesis, oxygen is produced and released by a tree. One large tree can provide a day's supply of oxygen for up to 4 people. Trees also store carbon dioxide in their fibers, helping to clean the air and reduce the negative effects that the CO2 could have had on our environment. In 1 year, a mature tree will absorb more than 48 pounds of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen in exchange. The needle-like leaves of coniferous trees produce and exude a variety of airborne essential oils called phytoncides. These protect them from bacteria, insects, and fungi. Exposure to these compounds also enhances the immune function in human beings. Inhaling the phytoncides found in coniferous forests helps to calm our nervous systems, reducing both psychological and physiological stress. Evergreen conifers, including pine, cedar, spruce, and fir, produce the most phytoncides. So walking through the subalpine and montane forests that flank the GDT offers immediate and immense health benefits. Trees really are worth hugging. Trees have the ability to provide as well for carbon storage. And this is something that, of course, is extremely important in terms of mitigating climate change. Carbon is naturally stored throughout the Rocky Mountains as organic molecules in both living and dead trees, as well as shrubs and other plants, of course. Shrubs help to stabilize soils, which in turn helps regulate and protect us from natural hazards such as landslides on steep slopes. Shrubs will also help to shade streams, preventing them from getting too warm for fish and other species during our increasingly hot summers. Let's get to know what trees are all about. So they are part of the flora, so they're in the plant kingdom. And we talked in the last webinar about non-vascular plants. Well, trees are in the vascular plant group. And so we'll be focusing on that. And trees that really excel at the vascular distribution of nutrients and water up and down their trunks between the roots and the leaves. And there's 2 types of trees. There's the coniferous trees and the deciduous trees. So coniferous trees have cones, hence the word coniferous. And deciduous trees are the ones that lose their leaves in the fall. And just to make life interesting, there are also what are called deciduous conifers along the GDT, larch trees to be precise. And larch trees have needle-like leaves that they shed each autumn. And along the southernmost part of the GDT, you might see some western larch. And then you will soon be seeing up higher in the mountains, because the western larch are down more in the valleys and lower elevations. You'll start to see the subalpine larch. And the subalpine larch extend from Waterton to Lake Louise, or just north of Lake Louise at the higher elevations. And then beyond that, you don't see larch. You might catch a glimpse of a third larch species called the tamarack, which grows in wet areas in the boreal forest in the vicinity of the northernmost part of the GDT, north of Jasper National Park. So it's reportedly found in the Wilmore Wilderness Park in Alberta and in Kakwa Provincial Park in BC, although I haven't personally seen it right near the GDT, but it's possible that it is found in Kakwa. I just haven't been up there, so I haven't seen it personally. All members of the larch family are conifers and bear cones, not flowers, because most of the deciduous trees that you'll see, they are part of the group called flowering plants, not like the conifers, which bear cones instead of flowers. And all of the larch species have needle-like leaves. What is unusual is that they have adopted the deciduous habit or way of living similar to the broad-leaved flowering tree species. The deciduous broadleaf trees that you will see along the GDT belong mostly to the poplar family. Members of this family include the black cottonwood, which grows along streams in the valley bottoms and requires a lot of moisture, and balsam poplar with its sweet-smelling leaves, which turn gold in the autumn. The poplar family also includes trembling aspens, known as quaking aspens in the USA, whose leaves flutter in the wind due to the way the leaf stem connects to the twig. Unlike many other deciduous broadleaf plants, trembling aspens have a lot of chloroplasts on both the top and the bottom sides of their leaves, and these chloroplasts contain the chlorophyll required, along with sunlight and water, to produce the carbohydrates through the process of photosynthesis. The trembling or quaking of the leaves of aspen alternately turns both the top and bottom sides of the leaves towards the sun, enabling each leaf to produce at least double the amount of food as other plants whose leaves do not move in that manner. Trembling aspens can get confused with paper birch, which becomes more common as you head north along the GDT. You don't really see birch until you get up towards Jasper. If you look, other than a little bit near Waterton, if you look carefully though, you will notice that aspen trunks have a pale yellow, beige, or greenish appearance, whereas paper birch trunks are white. Trembling aspens have smooth bark with a powdery surface that acts as a sunscreen, whereas paper birch bark is rough and can peel off. The aspen bark is marked with black horizontal scars and prominent black knots. The birch is marked with horizontal scars as well, but it does not have the eye-like scars. In other parts of North America, maples are large, imposing, broad-leaved trees. However, in the vicinity of the Great Divide, the Rocky Mountain maple is a tree-like shrub, never gaining the thick trunks of its eastern and western relatives that grow in lower elevations. The best places to see this species are in Waterton Lakes National Park and whenever you are on the moister west side of the divide, so Kootenay and Yoho National Parks, as well as the Blaeberry Valley and up into Kakwa. Well, the introduced European mountain ash can grow into a good-sized tree with a fairly thick trunk in gardens in mountain valley towns like Waterton and Jasper, Banff, Field even. I think I've seen a mountain ash there. The two wild species of mountain ash, the greens and the Sitka, will grow quite tall, but their growth habit is to have multiple graceful bendable trunks. Because of their flexible, bendy nature, the mountain ash and the Rocky Mountain maple can colonize places that have deep snow in the winter, including avalanche paths like this one crossing the GDT in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta. A thick, rigid trunk would break when hit by avalanching snow and debris, whereas the supple trunks of the mountain ash and the Rocky Mountain maple, as well as shrubs like red osier dogwood, various species of willows and alders, they remain intact under the weight of the snow and debris, and then they can spring up again the following spring and summer once the snow melts. Coniferous forests dominate much of the landscape through which the GDT passes. There are four main types of coniferous trees you will see along the GDT. The first is pine. There are primarily two species of pine, lodgepole and whitebark, with a third that you might see in the Crow's Nest Pass area at lower elevations, the limber pine, and another that you might see in the most northerly section, the jack pine. Next is spruce. There are two species of spruce, white and Engelmann. Then there are the true firs, primarily the subalpine fir, with balsam fir in the most northerly section of the GDT. There is also a false or pseudo fir, known as the Douglas fir, at low elevations in the montane forest zone that you might see in the most southerly sections of the GDT, particularly around the Crow's Nest Pass and up in Jasper, the lower elevations in Jasper. Let's start with understanding the pines. All pines have long, soft needles. The most common along the GDT is the lodgepole pine, which grows in really densely after a forest fire. Much of the GDT winds through forests that have burned within the past few decades and that are regenerating as lodgepole pine, which is a fire-adapted species. GDTA volunteers have cleared a lot of lodgepole pine to establish and maintain the trail. The lodgepole pine produces two types of female or seed cones, a serotinous or resin encased cone that only opens when subjected to the heat of a forest fire, and another that will open during the heat of the summer, releasing seeds that can be carried by the wind. Pines also have male cones that produce pollen. The other type of pine along the GDT is the whitebark pine, which is an endangered species in Canada. It is illegal to cut this tree because of its threatened status. So the GDT has to go around whitebark pine, and volunteers need to know how to identify it. Whitebark pine has a very restricted distribution and tends to grow on high elevation ridges. The easiest way to tell apart whitebark pine from lodgepole pine is to look at the needles. If the needles on a pine are in bunches of 5, it's a whitebark pine. If the needles are in groups of 2, it's a lodgepole. So the limber pine, found on lower elevation sandstone ridges in the Crow's Nest Pass area, is another 5-needle pine that is also legally protected by Canada's Species at Risk Act, as well as provincially in Alberta. And thus, it cannot be cut. So just remember, because it is also a 5-needle pine, needles in 5 keep it alive. Now we will learn about the spruce. White spruce is found everywhere, from the valley floor to mid-elevations. Engelmann spruce grows in only high elevations. However, whenever these species grow side by side in the middle elevations, they interbreed or hybridize. The needles of both species are four-sided and sharp. However, needles on white spruce are arranged spirally on the stem and are whitish green in color, and those on the Engelmann spruce are arranged in all directions and have two white bands on the upper and lower surfaces. They are bluish green in color. These differences in the way spruce needles look and are arranged on the stem are the easiest way to tell the two species apart, because cone shape, size, and color, and the tree's bark color and texture are all too similar to make an accurate identification. Like pine, spruce have both male and female cones. Male cones produce pollen that gets transported by the wind, and female cones produce seeds once fertilized by the pollen. Old spruce trees are the best place to shelter from sudden Rocky Mountain rainstorms. The branches, with their dense covering of needles, intercepts moisture, so it is often dry underneath their boughs. After the rain stops, the moisture seeps down the trunk and drips from the branches, creating a moist microclimate long after the rainstorm has passed. Long-term GDTA volunteer and trip leader Dave Higgins maintains that spruce trees, especially white spruce, make the best trees upon which to paint the distinctive orange blazes to mark the GDT route outside of the national parks. There's lots to love about the magnificent spruce trees along the GDT. Perhaps the one thing people do not love about spruce trees is handling spruce needles, as they are sharp and spiky, unlike the soft, friendly feel of fir trees. Both the needles of subalpine fir or balsam fir in the north and the Douglas fir, which is not a true fir, in the south, feel soft to the touch. However, the cones look very different and are positioned differently on the tree. Douglas fir cones hang down, whereas subalpine fir cones stand upright, and there are other differences. Subalpine fir bark is silvery gray, has distinctive resin blisters on it, and ignites readily, whereas Douglas fir bark is dark, thick, and furrowed and provides resistance to light ground fires. However, the Keno forest fire that swept through Waterton Lakes National Park in 2017 was so intense that it destroyed the bark and burned away the roots and the organic soil, killing old Douglas fir trees that had withstood many previous forest fires. This tree is right along the GDT, and you can just see what a hot fire it was in 2017. The growth form of subalpine fir and Douglas fir is also very different. Douglas fir branches are thick and broad, and the tree has an overall robust pyramid shape. Subalpine fir live high up in the subalpine forest zone, also known as the snow forest, because of the heavier snowfalls. As a result, the branches of subalpine fir are short and slant down to shed the snow. Unlike most conifer species, subalpine fir has what's called weak apical dominance. That's the phenomenon whereby the main central stem of the plant is dominant over other side stems. So it grows up in that typical pointy Christmas tree shape. Subalpine fir commonly develops multiple points of apical dominance, usually in one of two situations. First, an injury to the growing tip will stop production of a growth hormone, and more than one secondary growing tip independently assumes dominance, leading to a very bushy-looking tree. Second, a lower branch grows toward the ground and roots, a process that's called layering, after which the rooted branch assumes apical dominance, independent of its mother tree, leading to multiple seedlings emerging from these many rooted branches. And this particular aspect of subalpine fir has posed significant consequences for GDTA trail work volunteers and GDT hikers. A good way to tell the difference between spruce and true fir trees is that the seed cones at the top of spruce trees hang down, whereas the subalpine fir cones stand up on the branches. Subalpine large cones are small and resemble miniature Douglas fir cones. Subalpine larch, like other larches, grow fresh, new green needles each spring. These needles develop into soft, bright green needles that produce food for the tree all throughout the summer. In the fall, the carbohydrates that were produced and the chlorophyll are all put back into the roots, exposing golden yellow pigments in the needles. The tree also puts any toxins it has taken in over the growing season from microscopic forest fire smoke particles or other pollutants in the air, water, or soil, and stuffs them into the needles before allowing the needles to detach and blow off in the next wind. Microorganisms then decompose the needles, breaking down any toxins and feeding the soil. In my opinion, the subalpine larch is the coolest tree on the GDT. There's one conifer I haven't mentioned, and that is because it makes a good transition as we move from trees to explore some of the shrubs you will see along the GDT, and that is the juniper. There are 3 species of junipers in the vicinity of the Great Divide. One is the Rocky Mountain juniper, which is a tree. However, the only places you might see one are in the lower elevation areas near Upper Waterton Lake, in the Crow's Nest Pass, and at Old Fort Point in Jasper National Park. The common juniper is a very common shrub, and you will see it all along the trail in the dry forested areas and on open ridges. You might notice it more if you brush against its prickly needles, particularly if you're wearing shorts. They are even sharper than spruce needles. The creeping juniper is a ground-covering shrub with soft needles, just like the name sounds, and it's not seen as often as the common juniper. It tends to need a bit more moisture. All junipers produce fleshy blue cones that most people think are berries. A mountain songbird, the Townsend solitaire, feeds almost exclusively on juniper cones during the winter months. In the fall, this bird migrates from high elevations down to the major Rocky Mountain valleys, where it sets up territories based on the number of mature juniper with mature and abundant cone crops. Besides junipers, other shrubs that you will encounter along the GDT tend to be not conifers, but deciduous and flowering plants. And these include a few species of birch, including the water birch, which can actually grow into a pretty good sized tree, like quite tall. And the other ones are definitely shrubs, the dwarf birch and the bog birch. The majority of the shrubs that you will encounter along the GDT are alders and willows. There are a few ways to tell alders and willows apart. Alders bear distinctive male and female catkins, and they're on the same bush, the male and the female catkins. The female catkins are on stalks with several in a cluster, and they look like cones. They start off green, and as they mature, they turn into brown, woody fruits called strobiles, which bear seeds. The strobiles stay on the bush after the seeds have been released, and through throughout the winter time. So you can almost always tell on alder bush in the winter. Willows produce catkins that are soft, silky, and silvery before the leaves appear in the spring. These catkins or pussy willows are often the first sign of spring in the Rockies, even appearing before snowmelt. And unlike alders, willows have either male catkins or female catkins. So there's girl willows and boy willows. Catkins remain on the bush after the leaves emerge. As the flowers develop and the anthers form, they may appear kind of yellowish or pink. Alder shrubs belong to the birch family of plants, and their leaves look birch-like. Willow shrubs belong to the willow family of plants, and their leaf shape varies, but none of the willow species found near the Great Divide have birch-like leaves. Willow leaves tend to be alternate, simple, usually long and narrow, and pointed at both ends. The leaves of alders retain their chlorophyll as long as possible. They thus remain green until they drop from the trees, at which time they turn brown and decompose. The alder has to make and remake new chlorophyll for its leaves every single spring. Willows are different. Willows reabsorb their chlorophyll and store it in their roots, leaving the remaining yellow, orange, and or red leaf pigments in their leaves, creating lovely fall foliage. While there are just a couple of alder species along the GDT, numerous willows make their home in the Rockies. Some of the ones you will likely encounter include, clockwise from the top left, the attractive and aptly named rock willow, which many people do not even realize is a willow. Barrett's willow, smooth willow, and the tiny low-profile alpine willow that ekes out a living on alpine tundra. Willow species vary greatly in appearance. Some species hybridize, making identification to the species level pretty challenging. Two other shrub species found in the subalpine forest zone that can prove challenging for GDTA volunteers to clear, primarily because of their dense, prolific growth, especially after they are pruned, include the white flowering rhododendron and the false azalea. The rhododendron is a deciduous, acutely branching shrub in the heath family with erect, ascending stems that grow densely along the margins of cool, moist, coniferous woods and frequently along shady stream sides. The bushes bear dainty clusters of mildly citrus-scented white flowers and attractive green leaves. The false azalea, another heath, has loosely grouped, spreading branches, sticky stems, and small, rusty bell-like flowers. It thrives in moist, shady areas like the steep slopes of mountains. The leaves and flowers emit an unpleasant, skunky odor when handled, crushed, or cut. So you can definitely tell if it smells sweet and citrusy, it's the rhododendron. And if it's skunky smelling, almost like the smell of marijuana, it's the false azalea. Some of the most beautiful ground covering shrubs in the vicinity of the Great Divide are the three species of mountain heathers. Their bell-shaped flowers come in white, pink, and pale yellow, and occasionally I have seen hybrids. There are many other important shrubs along the GDT that I will discuss in a future video. These are the shrubs whose flowers, once pollinated, become fruit. Here are examples of some of the delicious edible species in the genera Vaccinium, which is in the heath family, like the heathers, that both hikers and bears enjoy along the GDT. And these include the black mountain huckleberry, grouseberry, low bilberry, cascade blueberry, and oval-leaved blueberry. While it's fine to sample a few of these juicy berries as you hike the GDT, keep in mind that these are vital foods for bears and other wildlife. And also be aware that some berries are undigestible for humans and others are toxic. So it's crucial that you know how to identify what berries you see before you eat any of them. Before we leave the shrubs, I will mention the Devil's Club, one of the most formidable shrubs on the planet. Every surface is covered with spines, and the spines contain the toxic substance that irritates the skin whenever the spine scratches it. The attractive looking red berries are poisonous to people, even though grizzly bears can eat them. There are very few places, fortunately, along the Great Divide Trail where you will see this shrub. It is much, much more common in the Columbia Mountain system west of the Rocky Mountain Trench and in the Coast Mountains. However, it does appear here and there in small numbers along in a few places along Upper Waterton Lake in Alberta and in a few low valleys on the moist, wet west side of the Great Divide, such as the Blayberry Valley. I've seen it there, and in Yoho National Park. The leaves look like big maple leaves and are often confused with a large, robust-looking forb or flowering plant called the cow parsnip. There's the Devil's Club. There's the cow parsnip. Both of them have these large maple-like leaves. Now, the cow parsnip is a really important food source for bears, and it doesn't have a single spine on its stem or flowers, but it's big, and a lot of people don't realize that it's just a forb, a flowering plant, because it can grow 5, 6, 7 feet tall. I was on a work party in 2017 along the High Rock Trail, during which 2 of the GDTA volunteers working on their own mistakenly cleared out areas of cow parsnip, thinking the plants were Devil's Club. So we want to avoid making that kind of mistake in the future. To wrap up this talk, I will share a few thoughts on what we can do to appreciate and safeguard nature along the Great Divide. There are many excellent field guides that you can use to identify not just the flora, but also the fauna of the Canadian Rockies. A couple that are particularly useful for trees and shrubs are the alpine plants, British Columbia, Alberta, and Northwest North America, and the plants of the Rocky Mountains. Due to the weight of the field guides, it's best to carry them just on short day trips and use them to build up your identification skills before going out on a big section hike or through hike on the GDT. The apps, including Seek, are improving. They're not too bad with trees. They're still, and they're good with, telling the difference between an alder and a willow, that kind of thing. But, and they're reasonable with shrubs. You can't always trust the artificial intelligence identifications, though. So it's always good to double check. And when you post things on iNaturalist, you will get comments from other experts who will either verify or refute your observation. It's a really good idea to download the iNaturalist app to create an account and record your observations on iNaturalist. It helps to improve our collective understanding of which species are where and when. Now, just a warning, iNaturalist can consume a lot of iPhone resources and use a lot of data unless you take the measures that they recommend to avoid this. One of the most important things that you can do as a GDT hiker is to help, in order to help safeguard nature during your trip, is by adhering to no trace backcountry travel principles. And all you have to do is type in no trace backcountry principles into your browser and read the material under each of the 7 principles before you head out on the trail. The GDTA is doing its part to try to safeguard the endangered 5-needle pines along the GDT, the white bark pine and the limber pine. Volunteers identify these pines and mark them with white flags so that the pruning and brushing crews do not cut them when doing trail establishment and maintenance. While hiking on the GDT, always remember to be careful. Don't injure or remove any parts of these trees. Also, since researchers use citizen science data from iNaturalist to understand where white bark and limber pine grow and which trees are infected by the white pine blister rust, which is the reason why these pines are endangered, it's really good idea to identify the white bark and limber pine, and especially if they have blister rust on them, and to record those observations when you're out on the trail. The GDTA's decision back in the 1970s to use paint blazes to mark the GDT instead of a lot of nailed in markers and signs was done after research into what form of trail marking caused the least damage to tree health. And paint blazing is definitely superior to past damaging methods of blazing trails. The GDTA also takes care to prune branches close to the trunk rather than smashing or cutting off branches midway, which stresses the tree and also damages tools. That concludes my summary of the trees and shrubs of the Great Divide Trail area. If you have questions about the trees and shrubs of the Great Divide after listening to this video, please put them in the YouTube comments along with your contact information. And join me for the next video in the series on the wildflowers of the Great Divide. Thank you.